Oh, good morning. It's Tuesday morning, the 16th, I think, of, of April 2019. This is Mirador Television, broadcasting from Lewes in the county of East Sussex in the UK. And this morning, I suppose that we, along with many other people, are grieving at the fact that an iconic building in Paris has been so badly damaged. I mean, a lot of people say, well, what the hell, it's just a church. Well, it's not just a church, not to the French, and not to many, many thousands of people around the world, millions of people around the world who have been to it and have seen how magnificent it is, and with a thousand years of history behind it, including a couple of operas and a musical. It has caught the imagination of the world. It's a beautiful building. It's very classical in its style, and I've seen many historical events pass through its doors and outside in the streets of Paris around its circumference. I understand that some people may say, and incidentally, that's a view from the top. It's quite stunning. That many people will say, well, it is just a church. But I think that there's some places in the world, St. Peter's in Rome, Westminster Abbey in London, and for that matter, St. Paul's in London as well, St. Patrick's in New York, and many others around the world. I mean, I have one particular favourite that most people will never have seen, and that is the Roman Catholic Cathedral in the middle of Sarajevo, where for well over a year I worshipped each Sunday when they had an English service at around noon. In fact, I was privileged to read the lesson in that cathedral. It's the only cathedral I've ever read the lesson in, and that is my local church. But it does give you quite some inspiration. I know that we live in an age where going to church has ceased to become fashionable, and yet I feel a little bit sorry that people don't go from time to time. Even my own small church, St. Michael's in Lewes, it is a very ancient church. It goes back to, well, recorded at 1140. Some people think that it was built even earlier, and was the church for Lewes Castle, which was one of the first Norman castles to be built after the conquest. And I look at it and I get a sense of history, because several warriors are buried there who defended the shores of Britain when the French raided, particularly during the 100 Years' War. Tom Paine, the philosopher, orator, who turned out also to be a soldier and went off and initiated the American Revolution, was married there. And there are many other worthies who have passed through its doors. So I get a sense of history. It has beautiful stained glass windows, so I get a wonderful sense of artistry. I read words, whether you believe them or not, read words written by very wise men 2,000, 3,000 years ago. I sing hymns, music composed as long ago as 1200, 1300, and still in use today, and which many people probably hum, not realizing that they're hymns. I take part in a ceremony which is centuries old, and I have the company of people who enjoy the ritual and who also have a belief in God and Christ. Many people argue no such person existed, no such deity exists. Well, that's everybody's choice. But whatever else, the churches of this country and the churches throughout the world, and for that matter, a good many synagogues and a good many other religious buildings bring the same sort of focus onto the beauties of the earth. Okay, am I being a little bit maudlin this morning? Yeah, I suppose I am, because I think that a lot of people won't understand how devastating it is to the French nation and how devastating it is to those people who love beautiful architecture, but above all those people who have a huge sense of history. And whether you're a churchgoer, a church believer or not, the development of our country and of most of Europe and of many other parts of the world is involved, and can't be any other way, with the expansion of Christianity and, for that matter, of other religions throughout our world, throughout our society. And many people who don't believe would be appalled and are appalled if anybody threatens to pull down a church that is 1,000 years old. We have quite a few of them, around our part of the world. Anyway, apparently the fire has started in the roof. Firemen were hampered by the traffic and the crowds, so the blaze got hold and has destroyed a good part of the church. It wasn't deliberate from the initial findings. A lot of restoration was going on in that roof area, and it's probable that some materials helped start the blaze. But Notre Dame, in ruins this morning, but already very, very wealthy donors have pledged money to see it restored. And our reverence for buildings, historic buildings, beautiful buildings, is such that I'm sure it will be restored in exactly the same way that it was before it had this devastating fire, and that you'll be able to look again from the streets of Paris at it, and perhaps at the streets of Paris from it. Okay, I won't dwell too much on something which has devastated the world. It's interesting when you tap in on the internet to some of the news sources, is that they are covered with the reaction of politicians, celebrities and so on and so forth to this news this morning, which just shows the effect that it's had on the world. But there are a couple of other things that need to, of course, France is a leading member of the EU, and Brussels, Brussels is the heart of the EU, is this morning reported to be in a bit of a disarray about Brexit. That some people want to kick Britain out swiftly and decisively, and others want some form of lukewarm relationship. And they're beginning to fight amongst themselves about how this should be achieved. So apart from our own fights, we've now got the European Union in a bit of a disarray. So it's going to be very interesting to see where this whole thing comes out. The only thing that I hope is that it just shakes up leadership in all those countries. I have absolutely no faith in the EU leadership. I've lost faith in our own. And I must confess is that if something good doesn't come out of this, I shall be bitterly disappointed. Already, the candidates to take over from Theresa May in an anticipated leadership contest in the not-too-distant future are strutting their stuff. Just about everybody now has made sure that they made a speech of some sort. So there are about, 8 or 10 or 12 candidates. And quite often what happens is that the leaders in these polls and in this pre-election stuff don't end up as Prime Minister. Somebody comes from the wings and floats in. I think John Major was a prime example of that. and perhaps even Margaret Thatcher herself, because although she was a very, very feisty education secretary, I'm not sure that in those days particularly people saw a woman, the first woman to be Prime Minister in this country, as capable of doing the job. That was the way that people thought in the 1970s and the 1980s. And she turned out to be perhaps, next to Churchill, to be the most formidable leader that we've had in many, many a year. So it will be interesting to see what happens and what will result. Perhaps all this Brexit nonsense and families not speaking to each other and all the rest of it will actually turn out to do some good for either this nation or the European Union or the world or whatever. Who knows? But it should be watched closely. But then on May the 2nd, here in Lewis, we have a local election. And I was interested to see that the Conservatives rounded up a group of people in Wealdon and put their faces onto the newspaper. These are the Conservative candidates. And then Labour had done the same. And the Liberal Democrats had done the same. Well, I say none of the above. Party politics does not have a part to play in local politics, in local governance. Let's try and see if we can get some decent independents going. There are some running, and certainly I will support an independent. Well, I won't if she or he is no good, but there are a lot of good, solid people running as independents. Take a look, because the independents are the only thing that kept democracy going in this council in the last 4 years. They have this iniquitous cabinet system, which I think that the two parties, the major parties, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, will use as a stitch-up again to be able to steer our local government in the way that they want, which is disastrous. The Eastbourne-Lewis executive merger has produced nothing but grief all the way around. And it continues on a day-to-day basis. People having problems, either getting through, not getting through, not getting the right services, and so on. The only people who seem to be efficient are the council tax people. And even there, they've got a computer which sends out pieces of paper which they say one thing in one letter and immediately say the opposite in another. So the executive also, well, in fact, if anything, the executive have been the people who have failed to deliver under this new scheme. But the politicians also, if they use the executive system, it means there are only 3 or 4 people pulling the strings, and the others really don't get a look in. So what's the point in democracy? What is the point in us voting for a councillor? I don't know. I can't see it. So first of all, find out whether your local councillor or your local candidates are going to be chummy with the executive, or are they going to do what they're supposed to do, and keep an eye on it and make sure that it's efficient and it delivers to us what we expect to, and for the pay that we do, we give them, which is pretty hefty. So when you go to the polls, think very carefully and go to the polls, because a lot of us moan after the election only to find out that only 35% of us voted. Well, you can't have a moan if you didn't cast your vote. And there's plenty to moan about on this council. So ask questions, get involved. This is our chance to select leaders that we want and we need. And let's hope that in Lewis and in the district, we don't suffer any great disasters such as happened in Paris overnight. I think that's enough for this morning. Toodle pip.